Why do tyrants abhor free speech? This is a very big question that many of you may think you know the answer to. There's an uncommon way to tackle this question, especially in the context of some of the events happening today, such as the subject of this video, where we'll be discussing how Elon Musk is currently at war with the European Union and also the United Kingdom government over free speech concerns on his platform. And we're going to contextualize this question, and we're going to really drive home the answer to this question in a way that'll hopefully help you all understand just how much is at stake in the conversation around free speech. Before we get into all that, my friends, hopefully you're doing well. I am Christian Watson. I am your host. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, do all that good stuff. Thank you guys so much for being here. Now enjoy the video. So, when we think of tyrants and how tyrants operate, many people have a certain idea of this menacing figure that stands over you, giving you orders, who has wanton control over everything and anything that happens in a given society. But the truth is, this is only one version of the idea of a tyrant. And to understand how some of the antagonists against free speech operate today, you must understand what they are at their fundamental core, and then you must understand how what they are motivates their worldview. See, Elon Musk, as many of you probably understand, has come under fire recently for allowing people to share information about the riots in the UK without being impeded unduly by what is called, I think as a euphemism, content moderation, but what is ultimately, when you lift up that pretty phrase and you actually look at the nature of that word, what that nature of that word contains, censorship. He has opposed that, and he said, no, we're going to have an open discourse to this. Keir Starmer and several people within the British media, including a Guardian columnist, actually said that Elon Musk should be put on trial. Keir Starmer suggested that social media companies should face penalties for aiding and abetting the flow of disinformation. And most recently, and as of the date of this video, the EU, the European Union, one of the most powerful internationalist bodies, actually wrote a letter to Elon Musk, essentially threatening him, suggestively, to be careful with his interview of Donald Trump, and also to be careful about the flow of hate and misinformation. Now, we'll examine that letter in a second, but I want to get back to my earlier point about tyranny. What is a tyrant? So, there are two senses of the word tyrant. One that is not commonly used in the modern parlance, and one that is commonly used. But they're actually not all that different because they feed into each other. The first sense of the word tyrant comes from the ancient Greek tradition, particularly from Xenophon, who wrote a story, a philosophical dialogue that you could call the Hero. And in that dialogue, Xenophon paints this picture of these two people. There is a poet, there is a speaker, and then there is this tyrant. He's like a ruler, a king. And in this dialogue, they talk very much about what it means to be a person in authority or a person in the public eye, what it means essentially to be a tyrant. And ultimately, this story, along with the Republic, which was written, of course, by Plato, which talks about this issue in around chapter 7, chapter 8 as well, where Socrates expounds on this issue. A tyrant in the personal sense simply means somebody is not in control or in check with all of their passions. A tyrant, someone who is tyrannical in the personal sense, is someone whose passions, desires, their appetites are just not checked or balanced by anything. So essentially, a tyrant is one who is tormented by his own lack of self-control in moderation. Some examples of a personal tyrant would be an alcoholic, or someone with a gambling addiction, someone with a sex addiction. There's many different things. Someone who has unrestrained anger issues, and even somebody who is a politician or an authority figure who is drunk on power and has no limits other than their own desires on how to exercise their power. Or if they do have other limits, those limits are subordinated to their own desires. This category would become exceptionally important in a second when we evaluate exactly how the EU bureaucrats in this case and the enemies of free speech are personal tyrants. Well, a political tyrant going a few thousand years in the future I think the definition of a political tyrant is best represented by the Jeffersonian tradition. And Jefferson essentially said that tyranny happens when you have a system of governance in which power is not checked by any mediating forces, where power is consolidated and allowed to roam free with very few limiting principles. This is kind of what modern audiences understand as tyranny. But the truth is this: the political tyrant, I will call this version, and the personal tyrant, I will call the Greek version. They're not very different people, because the political tyrant still has a personal character that impacts how they make their political decisions. A lot of people like to view authoritarians in isolation from their own self, in isolation from anything except the consequences of their action. But you can't understand, for example, Mussolini without understanding the broader culture of Italy and also understanding the personal pressures and desires that formed and shaped his character. You can't understand any of the great dictators without first understanding this, because oftentimes a political tyrant will be also a personal tyrant insofar as their passions, desires, in some way, shape, or form rule part of them. This is why they are political tyrants. Because only a personal tyrant with no sense of reason would be willing to wield power in such a destructive way that could cause massive loss of human life, that could cause potential political instability that would even undermine their own rule. We have many instances of dictatorships falling and falling gruesomely, even in the past 10, 15 years. Christian, why are you going down this big philosophical rabbit hole? Because the people in the EU who are trying to bully Elon Musk and who by consequence are trying to control your ability to think and speak freely are effectively personal tyrants who have political authority. You see, the thing about the personal tyrant is the personal tyrant is motivated to control free speech for two dominant reasons. And you will never understand why they do this unless you understand these reasons. They're motivated to control free speech because, number one, if someone is able to speak freely in an organic fashion, in a manner that reflects their viewpoint, it could harm the perception of that tyrant's institutions. The European Union, which is the institution that has come against Elon Musk, and the UK government being a lesser institution, insofar as obviously the EU has had much more of an impact on the milieu of Europe than just the UK government recently, but I digress. The European Union has set itself up as this purveyor of internationalism, this protector of human rights, this uniter of Europe, which has so much moral authority and benevolence. And this kind of, I call it borrowed moral currency. I call it borrowed moral currency because they're simply siphoning from ideas that human beings hold to be good and to be great, and then they're appropriating those ideas for their own purposes without actually going towards the substance of those ideas. It's like cotton candy. It's like a bubblegum pop. It sounds good. It may even feel good. But when you dig beneath the surface, there's nothing there. Or if there is something there, it is decidedly rotten. So this borrowed moral currency that the EU has is that it is a preservation of Europe as a continent and a uniter of peoples. Well, that perception has been challenged in many cases, whether it be the Schengen zone and its liability in terms of opening European countries up to the loss of their culture. For those of you who not know, the Schengen zone is simply a rule that says that European Union nation states have open borders. People can just cross any which way. There's not really many border controls. Or whether it be the fact that there is a lot of concerns about technocracy with the EU, regulating people from afar, so on and so forth. That perception has been challenged. But when free speech exists, speech is the accelerant of an institution's decline or its success. And so the tyrant, the personal tyrant, must protect perception because perception enables him to carry out his unmediated passions and by consequence carry out his political project. The moment perception is against him is the moment he begins to struggle. This is why dictatorships like China and other places always, or North Korea, they control the flow of information. Because perception is what builds kingdoms, but it can also destroy kingdoms as well. But the second reason why the tyrant opposes free speech, and this is a more sinister reason even, less of a selfish reason, is that free speech challenges their own view of civil society. The tyrant, and especially those tyrants that occupy the EU, have a view of civil society that mixes ethics with sensibilities, and they package them as a deal. They mix ethics with how people feel or how people might perceive something, and they tie these two things together while simultaneously enabling unethical behavior. So, for example, in the name of protecting the sensibilities of somebody, in the name of protecting their feelings or protecting them as a person by extension of protecting their feelings, they will engage in speech policing and censorship and the imposition of false categories upon the discourse, hate speech being a false category, and they will shift the terms of moral thinking towards their side, whereas actual moral thinking says no, there is a duty for people to be honest to veracity. That is one of the primary moral principles, and to be honest, you must be able to express yourself, and to express yourself, speech must be as unimpeded as possible. That's actual moral thinking that builds societies and allows civil society to flourish. But for the tyrant, that's an inconvenient truth. So what do? You switch the terms of moral thinking. Is this understood, guys? The truth is very simple, my friends. There is an attempt to reorganize how we see the world and how we see society. And that attempt is endemic in those who seek to control things or seek to implement their agenda through means that are less than legitimate. Now, let's actually look at the EU letter before we close here. The EU Commissioner, Terry Britton, sent this letter to Elon Musk. I will read to you a little bit of this letter right now. The letter says the following. Dear Mr. Musk, I am writing to you in the context of recent events in the United Kingdom in relation to the planned broadcast on your platform X of a live conversation between a U.S. presidential candidate and yourself, Donald Trump, which will also be accessible to users in the EU. I understand you are doing a stress test of the platform. In this context, I am compelled to remind you of the due diligence obligations set out in the Digital Services Act, as outlined in my previous letter. As the individual entity ultimately controlling a platform with over 300 million users worldwide, one of which is in the EU, third of which is in the EU, that has been designated a very online platform, you have a legal obligation to ensure X's compliance with the EU law. Again, it's about perception. This notably means, watch this very closely, quote, on one hand, that freedom of expression, including media freedom, are effectively protected, and on the other hand, that all proportionate and effective mitigation measures, these euphemisms, that ultimately mean terrible things, but they sound nice. Mitigation sounds very different from censorship, but they're actually talking about censorship. Mitigation measures are put in place regarding the amplification of harmful content in connection with relevant events, including live streaming, which, if unaddressed, might increase the risk profile of X and generate detrimental effects on civic discourse and public security. There's a much more to the letter, but I'm going to stop there. Essentially what he is saying, what this commissioner is saying, is that if X does not control certain kinds of content, it will have negative consequences for society, and therefore the EU must crack the hammer of law down upon X. Now, what's very interesting is that the irony of this is lost on people like Mr. Breton, because the irony of this is that his claim is inherently contradictory. See, again, the idea that you can censor people in society and that somehow is going to have a positive effect because some people may dislike some things actually is the opposite of protecting civil discourse. And yet, in the same vein, they are saying that their behavior would protect civic discourse and public security against freedom of speech. It makes no sense because there's a basic contradiction. And this contradiction is part and parcel to something I personally call proximity ethics, which is where you assess the goodness or the badness of something based on what it is close to, as opposed to basing it on its own merits and what it may imply on its own terms. This way of conducting ethics obviously relies, again, on sentiment and not on reason and substance. So an example of this would be saying, there is someone on X who said something that is offensive towards a minority in the EU. And that minority had hurt feelings for it, and those hurt feelings are causing mental distress. And that mental distress, in mass enough terms, are harming public security. That would be one of the formulations of this idea. Well, the problem with this is very simple. Well, number one, it is not the duty of someone else to protect your sensibilities. The problem with this idea of I call it disembodied harm, is that it assumes that someone feeling harm through their perception is the same thing as them physically receiving harm. That's a false conflation, because harm can only be understood in a measurable fashion. And you cannot measure a subjective notion of harm. So conceptually, it falls apart. The foundations collapse, the house is no more. But if you want to go and take it a little bit further on the logic game here, you want to go a little bit further, you can't simply say, just because this can be used in a bad way and people use it in a bad way, we should assume the thing as a whole, the principle as a whole, the action as a whole, is somehow bad. That's obviously not true. If someone goes ahead and uses a car to murder somebody, it does not mean a car is meant for murder, nor does it mean that cars should be viewed as murder weapons with suspicion. It doesn't mean that whatsoever. It simply means there was somebody that had bad intentions and they acted on those intentions. Similarly, just because people use their right to express themselves in a bad way does not mean that's a bad thing. I'll leave you guys with one last thing here. Free speech is a prerequisite for civil society. Why is it? Because civil society is based on cooperation. And that cooperation presupposes a mutual respect for people. And that mutual respect for people presupposes basic moral understanding, such as an understanding and an appreciation of rights. And rights impose limits on both society, individuals, and the government, and then form the moral context in which behavior, morally responsible behavior, can act within. So if you defy rights, you defy duties. If you defy duties, you defy responsibility. If you defy responsibility, you defy the basis for cooperation. And if you defy the basis for cooperation, you defy the very existence of civil society. The censorious bureaucrats don't want civil society. They want a form of elevated slavery that they can justify with their borrowed moral currency. We ought to reject their vision, and we ought to embrace the pro-civil society, the pro-human vision, based on natural law, based on our powers of reason, that will allow us to overcome the petty tyrannies of men who cannot stand to have their versions of societies that are implemented through political will, as opposed to organic happenings, be challenged. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can. I love you guys so much. Thank you so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.